Hi guys, today we'll delve into the case of a 9.5-month pregnant woman who was attacked in her own apartment in the middle of the night. As the police began their investigation, they uncovered some very unexpected and chilling details. Eventually, they managed to unravel the truth in this complex case, but the ending was so shocking that even the detectives were stunned by those twists. Diana Diallo was born in 1959 in a quiet suburb city of Los Angeles called Tustin. Her dad was in the military, and her mom worked at a small clothing factory. When Diana was 19, she met a guy named Kevin Green. She was at a bar with her friend when some men started bothering them. He was being too pushy, so Kevin decided to step in. After he made the guy go away, Diana offered to buy him a drink to say thanks. A few days later, they went on a date, and things moved pretty fast from there. At the time, Kevin was already married, but he and his wife were in the process of getting divorced. Meanwhile, he and Diana moved in together, and she got pregnant. As soon as Kevin's divorce was finalized, they got married the same day, eagerly awaiting the birth of their daughter. They rented an apartment in a small complex in Tustin. Kevin served in the Marines, working as a helicopter mechanic at the nearby base. Diana used to work with her mom at the clothing factory, but as her pregnancy progressed, she chose to stay at home and prepare for the arrival of their daughter. By the end of September 1979, Diana was 9.5 months pregnant, and she was due to go to the hospital any day now. On the evening of September 30th, after watching a movie together, Diana and her husband got into an argument. The stress of impending parenthood had been weighing on both of them, so they'd been fighting quite a bit lately. Kevin decided to take a drive to a nearby fast food joint to clear his head, and also avoid making the whole situation even worse. About 40 minutes later, a local police department received a chilling call. It was Kevin. He said that someone had shot his wife, and she needed an ambulance as soon as possible. At that time, a patrol car was nearby, and officers quickly arrived at the scene. Upon entering the apartment, they found Diana lying on the bed in her bedroom, covered in blood, seemingly from a head wound resembling a gunshot. The bedroom wall was also splattered with blood. Diana showed signs of life, trying to breathe, so the officers started performing first aid while they waited for the ambulance. They also asked Kevin to leave the room, as they were still unsure of what had happened. The medics soon arrived and carefully moved Diana into the ambulance. At first, they also thought she had a gunshot wound, but quickly realized it wasn't the case. The wound appeared to be caused by blunt force trauma. Kevin wanted to go with his wife, but the police didn't allow him to. They needed to take his statement, and at that moment, they were considering all possible scenarios, including his involvement in the attack. Kevin was clearly in shock and seemed to struggle to comprehend the officer's words. He even attempted to get into the ambulance, so they had to stop him. As it drove away, he began to regain his composure and finally told the police what had happened that night. Kevin explained that he and his wife had an argument, so he decided to go to a fast food joint to get burgers and clear his head. When he left the apartment, he realized he had left his keys inside, but chose not to go back for them. He simply shut the door and headed to his car. Kevin also mentioned that not far from their apartment complex, he saw a van with its back door open, and there was an African-American man walking back and forth to it. Given that it was around 2 a.m., Kevin found it a bit unusual. He drove to his favorite fast food place, but there was a long line, so he went to another one of the same chain a few miles away. He bought some burgers and headed home, which took about 40 minutes. When he got to the front door, Kevin found it wide open. He rushed inside and heard strange sounds, like someone snoring. Upon entering the bedroom, he saw Diana covered in blood, struggling to breathe, and immediately called the police. Some parts of Kevin's story immediately raised questions. For example, his decision to go for burgers in the middle of the night seemed odd. The whole trip also took him about 40 minutes, which was quite long, considering that all the restaurants were close to his home. Nevertheless, officers inspected the fast food bag, and the food was still warm. The receipt contained the restaurant's address and the time of purchase, corroborating his account. Based on this, the police allowed Kevin to go to the hospital. But first, they had asked him to provide a blood sample. DNA analysis wasn't available at the time, but experts could compare the blood traces found at the crime scene with Kevin's blood type. When Diana arrived at the hospital, doctors confirmed that the wound on her head wasn't from a gunshot. Most likely, the assailant used a small but heavy object, like a piece of wood, and inflicted a series of blows. At the hospital, Diana slipped into a coma. Doctors worked tirelessly for several hours to save both the woman and her unborn child. They eventually managed to stabilize Diana's condition, but she still needed surgery. Meanwhile, investigators requested medical experts to establish whether Diana had been sexually assaulted. Besides being standard procedure, Diana's positioning upon discovery prompted the officers to consider that possibility. The experts soon confirmed this version, discovering traces of semen on her body. However, there were a few complications. Kevin had informed detectives that they had been intimate a few hours before the argument that night, and DNA analysis was not yet available at that time, so even with a biological sample from the perpetrator, little could be done. Kevin and Diana's relatives spent the entire night at the hospital, hoping Diana and her baby could survive the attack. However, by morning, something unexpected happened. One of the monitors detected a sharp deterioration in the baby's condition, and despite the extensive efforts of the doctors, the girl didn't survive. As for Diana, medics performed surgery immediately after the baby's death, and her condition was stabilized. She remained in a coma, but her chances of survival were now considered as high. However, doctors didn't expect her to return to a normal life after such serious trauma. Meanwhile, detectives worked tirelessly to track down the perpetrator who attacked Diana. After her baby passed away, the case was classified as a homicide, and the local police department put all their resources to it. Despite the fact that Kevin provided an alibi, detectives didn't rush to rule him out as a suspect. His story raised numerous questions. He had an argument with his wife just hours before the attack, left the front door unlocked, and was absent for an extended period for a supposed quick trip to the fast food joint. His claim of seeing a suspicious man near the house in the middle of the night also seemed too convenient. But there was no evidence against Kevin. Moreover, the police already had another suspect. About a year before these events, crimes with a similar modus operandi had started happening in Tustin and its surrounding areas. In December 1978, an unknown perpetrator broke into the apartment of a 17-year-old girl, struck her with a piece of wood, and sexually assaulted her, resulting in her death. 4 months later, the same happened to a 21-year-old woman. Someone broke into her home and struck her with a piece of wood. She didn't survive either. In July 1979, the unknown perpetrator entered another woman's apartment and did the same to her, but she managed to survive. However, the victim spent several weeks in a coma due to her injuries, and her subsequent testimony didn't bring detectives closer to finding the attacker. In September 1979, less than a month before Diana's attack, the same happened to a 31-year-old woman who died the next day. Her son provided investigators with a description of the assailant, but the man still couldn't be identified. All these crimes shared striking similarities, just like the attack on Diana. Police were almost certain that they were dealing with a serial killer, and all their efforts were focused on catching this individual. He had already got a nickname, the Bedroom Basher. Considering that the perpetrator was committing his crimes with short intervals and operating in a relatively small suburban area of Los Angeles, detectives believed that he could strike again very soon. They decided to reach out to the public through the media and warn all women who lived alone, especially those in lower floor apartments, as they were apparently the preferred targets of the suspected serial killer. This sparked a wave of panic. Women began clearing store shelves of any means of protection, signing up for self-defense courses, and staying with friends and relatives, trying to safeguard themselves from the dangerous criminal. Police also began patrolling the streets at nightfall. Detectives interviewed anyone who could have had any connection to these crimes, and soon they received their first leads. Several neighbors of the victims reported seeing a suspicious white man with dark, thick hair near their houses. Although this description was quite superficial, police located several matching men, investigated them, but it led nowhere. A week after Diana's attack, doctors informed her loved ones that she had finally regained consciousness. But there was a serious problem. Diana couldn't speak or remember anything, and according to the doctors, her brain needed some time to recover, functioning at the level of a 6-year-old child. Around the same time, another attack happened in Tustin. An unknown assailant broke into the apartment of a 24-year-old woman, struck her several times with a piece of wood, and sexually assaulted her. Tragically, the victim died, and the police once again failed to catch the culprit. Diana spent several more days in the hospital, and her mind began to gradually return to normal. However, she had almost completely lost her memory and still couldn't recall even her parents. Doctors said her memory might eventually return, but warned her family not to recount anything to her and to allow her to remember everything on her own. Once her life-threatening condition passed, Diana was discharged from the hospital, and her family took her home. Since Kevin needed to work on the military base to pay the bills, they moved in with Diana's parents, who could care for her around the clock. 2 weeks later, another tragic attack occurred in the city with a similar modus operandi, and this time, the unknown assailant killed a 17-year-old girl. After being discharged from the hospital, Diana started attending physiotherapy, and her condition gradually improved. She still couldn't speak or remember what happened to her, but everything suddenly changed 6 weeks after the attack. During a physiotherapy session, the therapist brought up the attack and asked if Diana still couldn't remember who did it to her. To the doctor's surprise, Diana suddenly nodded and pointed to her wedding ring. When Diana's mother came to pick her up, the doctor told her about this, and the mother asked her daughter, "Was it Kevin who attacked you?" And Diana nodded. Right after that, her mother took her to the police station, where she spoke with the lead detective. He asked Diana a few more questions, and she confirmed that she suddenly remembered the moment of the attack, and the perpetrator was none other than her husband. For the detective, this completely changed the course of the case. He and his team were almost certain that Diana was attacked by the same serial criminal responsible for the other similar attacks. But now, the detective faced several questions. Could Kevin be the bedroom basher? He lived in the same area where the attacks happened, and even matched the description provided by several witnesses who saw a white man with dark hair. Or did Kevin decide to get rid of his wife by disguising himself as the active killer? Considering that all the actions of the bedroom basher were almost identical each single time, it wouldn't have been difficult. The detective thought that if he arrested Kevin now, his involvement in other crimes might never be proven, and Kevin himself could flee as soon as he realized he was caught. So, he made a difficult decision. He asked Diana and her mother to pretend that Diana still remembered nothing and to return home to Kevin. This was obviously a huge challenge for both of them, but they agreed nonetheless. Investigators put Kevin under surveillance and closely monitored all his movements, hoping to eventually link him to other attacks. Police spoke with Kevin's friends to learn more about the suspect, and they quickly found out something interesting. Those who knew him well said that his relationship with Diana was quite tense. The couple argued frequently, a fact also confirmed by neighbors who often heard their screams. According to friends, Kevin regularly complained to them that Diana refused to be intimate with him in the final months of her pregnancy. Yet, Kevin had described his relationship with Diana to detectives as nearly perfect. But besides that, detectives couldn't gather any additional useful information. Kevin behaved quite normally. He went to work and came back home without lingering anywhere else, and didn't raise any suspicions. The police also received results from the lab, revealing an interesting discovery. Besides the attacker's semen, they found skin particles with blood under Diana's nails. Specialists matched the blood type of the attacker to Kevin's blood sample, and it matched. It meant that Kevin had the same blood type as the person who attacked Diana. Based on this information, detectives came up with the most likely version of what had happened on that fateful night. Kevin indeed bought burgers at a fast food joint a few miles from home. The time on the receipt and cashier's words confirmed his presence, so detectives believed he could have attacked Diana before leaving home, then quickly went to the fast food restaurant to create an alibi, explaining the extended 40-minute trip. Regarding motive, detectives theorized that Diana's refusal to engage in intimacy served as the trigger. Despite Kevin's claim that they had had sex hours before the incident, he frequently complained to friends about Diana's reluctance for months. Given the severity of the attack, detectives believe this was Kevin's breaking point. The police re-interviewed Diana, who confirmed she vividly remembered the attack, and Kevin was indeed the one who assaulted her. During the conversation, her mother said they could no longer pretend and live under the same roof as Kevin. After that, detectives decided to arrest him and proceed with legal action. Kevin was taken into custody while he was at a store to avoid risking Diana's family and conducting the arrest at their home. Kevin refused to admit guilt, insisting that everything happened exactly as he had told them. Preparation for the trial took 10 months. During this time, Diana's physical condition gradually improved. She could speak again, although not without difficulty. Diana was also examined by several doctors, who came to a unanimous conclusion that her brain had sufficiently recovered, and she was a reliable witness. Diana testified in court, confirming that the person who attacked her that night was indeed her husband. Kevin's defense insisted on his innocence, trying to use the fast food alibi, but it wasn't enough against the victim's testimony. In November 1980, Kevin was found guilty of killing his child and assaulting his wife. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Regarding Kevin's possible involvement in other murders and assaults, detectives noticed something interesting. Before Kevin's arrest, 2 more similar crimes occurred in their county, but both victims survived. They still hadn't been able to identify the attacker, so his identity remained unknown. But after Kevin's arrest, the attack suddenly stopped. Before that, the bedroom basher committed his crimes quite frequently, sometimes with only a few weeks between them. But once Kevin was arrested, there were no more similar crimes at all. Right after the sentencing, Diana filed for divorce, and Kevin didn't try to object it. Since then, Diana continued to work on her recovery, but it was quite challenging considering the injuries she sustained. Her brain almost returned to normal, but some problems remained with her forever. She partially lost her hearing and vision, and still struggled to speak. As for Kevin, he continued to insist on his innocence for years. His time in prison wasn't easy. Other inmates repeatedly attacked him for killing a child, and Kevin ended up in the hospital multiple times. When he had the opportunity to apply for parole, the commission denied it, and over the following years, he received 3 more denials. The main reason for these decisions was that Kevin had never admitted his guilt, which was seen as a lack of remorse. When DNA analysis became widely utilized in forensics, Kevin attempted to request analysis of the existing samples and comparison with his DNA, but this request was rejected due to the fact that he didn't have enough money to pay for the analysis. This went on until 1996, when the police department reopened the investigation into a series of attacks allegedly committed by the bedroom basher. Throughout this time, semen samples taken from the victims' bodies were stored in the laboratory. Now, detectives had the opportunity not only to determine if one person was behind all these crimes, but also possibly to identify them. Kevin remained the prime suspect, but when experts obtained the DNA profile of the perpetrator and added it to the database, there was an unexpected twist. All these samples matched another man named Gerald Parker. Parker was arrested in the same year as Kevin. He assaulted a 13-year-old girl in Tustin and was caught shortly after. At the time, detectives did not link this crime to the series of attacks because they had a different pattern. While the bedroom basher targeted victims late at night in their apartments, Parker abducted the girl on the street. Since then, he had been serving his sentence in prison and was set to be released in just a few days. After investigators obtained DNA matches for Parker in all the unsolved cases, they also remembered the attack on Diana. Although this crime was considered solved, detectives still considered its connection to the other similar cases highly likely. Now, they understood that Kevin definitely wasn't the serial killer. leaving them with just one question: did he really attack his wife? Interestingly, during those years, Parker served at the same military base as Kevin and also owned a dark-colored van. As we recall, on the very first day, Kevin told the police that he saw an African-American man in front of their house walking near a dark van. This made detectives wonder, what if Parker was behind the attack on Diana? The local prosecutor visited Kevin in prison and informed him of the progress in the investigation of the Bedroom Basher murder series. He then asked Kevin to provide a direct sample of his DNA for analysis. Kevin, who had been trying to do this for years, immediately agreed. While experts conducted the analysis, detectives went to see Parker in prison. At that point, they hadn't yet charged him with the series of attacks because they needed time to prepare such a complex case. Nevertheless, the police decided to talk to the suspect, hoping he might give them a confession. Parker began to deny his involvement in the series of crimes, so detectives shifted the conversation to the attack on Diana. Before questioning him, they reviewed Parker's case and found something interesting. After his arrest for assaulting the girl, he told the police that military service was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Detectives decided to use this to their advantage and questioned how he could let another soldier take the blame for his crime. They continued pressing Parker, appealing to his loyalty to the military, until he suddenly said that another person was indeed serving time for the murder he committed. He continued, admitting that on that night, he did indeed drive to Kevin's house in his van. His plan was to roam the neighborhood, peering into ground floor windows, as he had done many times before, looking for his next victim. But this time, he heard screams from Kevin and Diana's apartment, and a man came out onto the street. Parker noticed that he didn't lock the door, waited for a few minutes, then entered the apartment and assaulted Diana. He also said that he didn't know her husband since they had different duties on the military base. Parker also confessed to the other crimes, admitting to 6 murders and 3 non-lethal attacks. After the police obtained confessions, DNA results proved Parker's involvement and Kevin's innocence. The prosecutor promised to overturn his sentence as soon as possible, and a few days later, Kevin walked free after spending 16 years behind bars. The twist in this case caused a widespread outcry. It wasn't just because an innocent man spent nearly half his life for someone else's crime, but also because it took so long for the police to establish the real killer's identity. However, that wasn't the last twist in this case. When Kevin was released, the state of California agreed to pay him $10,000, which was a relatively small amount of money even for those times. Several years later, he got an additional compensation of $100 for each day spent in prison, totaling $620,000. But the story didn't end there. Despite Kevin's full exoneration, Diana refused to believe in his innocence. Up until that point, she had claimed Kevin was the only one who attacked her. However, after biological material from her body matched Parker's DNA, she came up with a new version. Diana claimed that on that night, Kevin attacked and assaulted her before leaving, and then Parker entered the apartment and did the same to her. Parker himself repeatedly stated that when he entered the apartment, the woman was simply lying on the bed, without any visible injuries or signs of distress. He also claimed that he was the one who struck her on the head. Diana's family proposed another theory, suggesting that Kevin might have asked Parker to commit the crime, which is why he left the house that night, leaving the door open. But Parker continued to insist that he didn't know Kevin. There were numerous people on the military base, many of whom didn't know each other personally. Besides, such a version would imply that Kevin should have known Parker was the serial killer to ask him something like that, which he vehemently denied. Kevin also denied any connection with Parker, insisting he would never harm Diana, let alone their unborn daughter. He maintained that he left the door unlocked simply because he didn't want to return for the keys right after the argument with his wife. He also added that he still blames himself for that decision. Diana insists on her version of events to this day, and there could be a simple explanation for that. The trauma she endured as a result of the attack had a profound impact on her brain. When she emerged from the coma, doctors warned all her relatives not to tell her of what had happened. The reason was that at the time, her brain could accept any information as true, and she would believe such memories to be accurate and real. It's worth noting that even at the time of Kevin's release, 16 years after the incident, she continued to experience serious difficulties. For example, Diana struggled to process fast speech, indicating that the consequences of the trauma had an irreparable impact on her brain. It cannot be ruled out that the trauma is the primary reason for her conviction of Kevin's involvement. As for Parker, in 1999, he was sentenced to death, but this sentence has never been carried out. After many years of waiting in prison, California imposed a moratorium on executions, so Parker continues to serve his sentence behind bars to this day. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.